G'day legends, in this video I wanted to pack just a little bit more of Tony Ferguson's recent non-retirement that happened at UFC Fight Night Abu Dhabi. It is pretty sad to see the state of Tony Ferguson's career, one of the absolute goats of the sport. It's pretty sad to see the way that the UFC were planning to send him off compared to some other athletes that we've had recently. And he said some pretty interesting things in his post-fight press interview. So we're going to get into all of that because I do think the Tony Ferguson story is unfortunately not over yet, and there is a little bit more to it. So first of all, the actual retirement itself that happened at Abu Dhabi, or the non-retirement that happened. I think the crowd talked him back into it. There was a moment there when he grabbed the microphone and started looking around the crowd, and the crowd started cheering and the cameras started panning to them. There was this look in his eyes, one of the saddest looks that you can see in a man's eyes. And as someone who has been a fan of Tony Ferguson for so long, it does suck to see that so much. It was almost like he knew in his heart that it was over, but he just could not walk away from the sport in that moment. And he really should have, because that performance against Michael Chiesa, Tony Ferguson, the fighter that we all know and love, truly is dead. That fighter is gone. He doesn't exist anymore. Tony inside the cage on Saturday night, or Saturday, looked so sloppy, looked so slow, looked just missing everything. There is a point in Tony Ferguson fights, or in the last couple of Tony Ferguson fights, where he always has a moment where we go, oh yeah, at least he had that first round against Chandler. Oh, you know, he did put hands on Dariush. There is always a moment in a Tony Ferguson fight recently where you can point out something good, a decent takeaway. He didn't have that moment against Paddy Pimblett, and he had even less of those moments against Michael Chiesa. Tony Ferguson is steadily getting worse and worse and worse as the years go on. That is not that much of a shocking thing to say. Combat sports is a young man's game. Tony Ferguson is aging. Imagine what would happen if you just keep putting Chuck Liddell or BJ Penn in there every 6 months. You would see a degradation of their skills to the level of which they would be unrecognizable fighters, and you yourself, someone with almost no fighting experience, would be sitting there going, I reckon I could have a crack at this bloke. He looks like absolute dog shit. That is what we saw with Tony Ferguson on Saturday night, and that hurts me to say. So, with what we saw on Saturday night, absolutely no speed, no skill, no testosterone left. Tony Ferguson takes off his gloves, DC comes into the cage, Michael Chiesa knows what's going on, and it's time to start rolling out the flowers for Tony Ferguson. Shame on the UFC at this part. Shame on the UFC. There was a moment where the crowd was cheering. Tony took the microphone, he was stuck for words, and that is where the UFC should have gone into DC's earpiece. Before Tony said the whole, I'm going to keep one glove, there was a moment of silence where DC had to kind of prompt Tony Ferguson. And rather than prompting Tony Ferguson, that is when the UFC should have said, all right, DC, we're going to play the package now, get him to look up at the screen in DC's earpiece. Michelle Waterson had her own package. Now look, the Karate Hottie has been a staple of the UFC for years, but she has not been a phenomenal athlete in the UFC. She's been average at best, but she's been around for so long, the UFC gave her the respect of putting together her own send-off package. Michelle Waterson. They didn't have one for Tony. It was a round one finish. The card was underway, it was running on time. There was still 10 minutes of fight time left in the TV schedule for the way the card is meant to go. I can understand sometimes when it's been non-stop decisions, we've got to get the card moving, people have spent too long on the microphone, they cut interviews short, but the card was running on time. Tony Ferguson had a first round finish. He didn't have he had a first round finish done to him. There was plenty of time for the UFC to run a promo. They understand how important Tony Ferguson is because they will CGI him versus Khabib into the promo for UFC 300. But in that moment, when his gloves are off, he's got nothing to say. He's looking into the arena. The crowd is cheering. In that moment, they have got nothing for Tony Ferguson. They know it could have been his last fight. They ship him over to the Middle East where the UFC fans can't enjoy him. They put him on a different time slot a week after conversations about how important time slots are for the US audience. And then when he is about to walk off, they don't see a single send-off. It's fucking pathetic from the UFC. Anyway, fuck, that's pathetic from the UFC. They're so annoying this year. Anyway, Tony comes out and does his post-fight press conference in the media scrum, and it's pretty clear that Tony Ferguson is not done. He does not know how to walk away from the sport. He wants to stay with the UFC, and it makes sense. Tony Ferguson has been part of the UFC for years. It is essentially part of his life, and we have seen fighters like this before, like your Chuck Liddells, Dustin Poirier's going through it at the moment, where they've stayed with one company, one workplace, one way of life for so long that they truly do not know what their lives would look like or how to move on without that company there. There's no reason that Tony Ferguson can't stay with the UFC. He talked about being a mental health coach down at the PI. That's a horrible idea. Tony Ferguson has no idea what a sports psychologist is. No idea at all. Every time he loses, he makes up excuses. Every time before the fight, it's the best training camp ever and he's just put his team back together. Apparently, he was vomiting before the Michael Chiesa fight. He's so nervous. Absolutely not for sports psychology. However, PI, at the UFC PI, as a conditioning coach, as a cardio coach, he would be a phenomenal asset to the UFC team and a phenomenal asset to young fighters that are trying to get themselves ready to go for 15 minutes, 25 minutes. Tony Ferguson's cardio has been renowned throughout his entire career. It was one of the big takeaways when Tony Ferguson said that he brought on David Goggins to help him with his mental toughness and his cardio. People across the board were saying Tony Ferguson's big problem is not his cardio nor his mental toughness. He's been put in certain positions where anyone would want to tap. The armbar from Charles Oliveira, he was able to grit through that. Tony Ferguson is known for his toughness and his cardio. So to put him in that kind of position at the UFC PI would keep him working in a company that he loves, stop him actually competing in combat sports, and help young up-and-coming fighters. The second option for him, again at the UFC PI in a coaching role, could be jiu-jitsu. Tony Ferguson's mind for jiu-jitsu is brilliant. The one takeaway would be that he would encourage fighters to stay on bottom position and chase submissions, which is a very 2016 form of MMA. Right now, jiu-jitsu on the bottom needs to be used to create scrambles to get up from the bottom. But still, his ability in chasing jiu-jitsu and his mind for jiu-jitsu for younger fighters training at the UFC PI, along with his conditioning, would be something that would fit the role of Tony Ferguson very, very well. The last thing that he got on to talking about in his post-fight press interview with the media team is the fact that he is still competitive in his blood. He still wants to compete in some way. And he alluded to putting on some shoes and throwing hands. Boxing, maybe even bare knuckle boxing. That would be the worst possible decision for Tony Ferguson. The amount of trauma that has already gone through that man's brain, plus the fact that he is not already the most mentally stable bloke on the planet. You don't want to see Tony Ferguson continuing to get punched in the head late into his 40s. There's too much of that. However, a company that he loves, the UFC, runs a thing called the Fight Pass Invitational Series, which is grappling and jiu-jitsu on Fight Pass, part of the UFC. That is a perfect thing for him to want to compete in and to continue to compete in, where he would bring a lot of eyes to the invitational, they're not pay-per-views, a lot of eyes to the invitational events. The fans could still see him. He would still be involved with the UFC. It would give him a reason to keep training at the PI. He could continue coaching at the PI. I think the next stage in Tony Ferguson's career is to give Dana White and Hunter Campbell that second glove and say, I am done with MMA, but I love your company, even though your company doesn't seem to love me. And put your name forward to do at least 1 or 2 Fight Pass invitationals every single year and ask if you could work at the UFC as a conditioning cardio coach or a jiu-jitsu coach. That would be the perfect future for Tony Ferguson. The worst option for Tony Ferguson would to say, you know what, I still feel pretty good. I still feel pretty athletic. Let me take off the gloves, put on the shoes and go try bare knuckle. He'll get his bloody head kicked in. That's it for today's video. Let me know down there in the comments. What do you think Tony Ferguson should do next? Do you think he should have one more fight in the UFC just so the UFC have a chance to send him off properly? If you like this video and this is your first one here, why don't you go ahead and consider subscribing to the channel. We try and do a video every day. I try and live stream as often as I can. We do watch-alongs, we do UFC 5 gameplay, we do live tier lists. If you've already subscribed and you want to help the channel grow, why don't you hit the like button? That helps push the channel out to new viewers, helps grow the channel that way. It's completely free. So if you could do that for me, that would be awesome. Until then, I will see you guys in the next video. You all have a great day.